Welcome back. We are back here on the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. He is Daniel Gallen. A little bit later, you will hear from our recruiting expert, Tyler Calvaruso, on this latest episode. We know you've been waiting a little while for one. As we told you upon our last episode, which was at this point about 10 days ago, I was headed out for some family vacation time. That happened. Big thanks to my teammates at Lions247 for giving me the freedom and space to go and kind of leave this all behind for a little while. Check back in now. Batteries are recharged. We've got football on the field here in just a matter of days at this point. It's spring break right now for Penn State, but when everybody gets back on campus, spring practice awaits us. We've got pro day next week as some former Nittany Lions standouts come back to campus and get to show off their skills in front of professional scouts and talent evaluators. So a lot coming your way. We're going to take an opportunity here on Monday, March 9th, to bring you up to speed on some things that we missed in terms of discussion here on the podcast. But certainly, if you follow our coverage at Lions247.com, they have been addressed. We'll play some catch up in the recruiting trail with Tyler later. But with Daniel, we've got some things to bounce around. We're going to talk about some NFL scouting combine reaction. NFL free agency starts this week, and there's a couple Penn State players or former Penn State players that are in the spotlight that we're going to discuss a bit. But we're going to begin this episode with the discussion about a Penn State starter who is sidelined for spring ball. Before we get there, big shout out to Cale Sanderson's wrestling program. What a remarkable run they have been on for a decade plus at this point, but yet another Big Ten championship. Mark Brennan was leading our coverage over the weekend for the Penn State Nittany Lions wrestling squad. School record for points and individual championships. 7 champions, 8 finalists, just a machine that they have been for a long time here. And next up, of course, is chasing after another national title. So good luck to those Nittany Lions. But Daniel, as I teased there for a moment, Anthony Donko, starting offensive tackle for Penn State to close out last season. We also saw him at guard for portions of the 2025 campaign. Will miss spring practices. Our Mark Brennan at Lions247 was the first to report that during our time away from this podcast. And he adds to a little bit of a list of projected starters who are going to miss some time here in camp. We'll talk about some of those others' names. But this really, while it's an opportunity for a lot of young players to step up, this to me is one of those guys who can maybe afford to spend some time watching this spring because he's played so much football, more than 20 starts to his credit. You'd love for him to get work with new offensive line coach Ryan Clanton, new offensive coordinator Taylor Mauser. But Donko will spend time sidelined this spring. Undisclosed injury. We don't have the specifics to share with you here, but he is expected to make a recovery. This is kind of cleaning up an injury from last season versus something new popping up in February or March. And so your general reaction to this news, as I said, first reported at Lions247.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these things that there's really 2 ways that you can look at it where, on the one hand, like Anthony Donko, probably in the James Franklin universe, is probably one of those players at this point in his career who can get a little bit of that veteran treatment. Who, maybe, what he is, therefore he doesn't need to take a full workload. He can get a look, at some other guys. So, like you said, this is an opportunity for other players. On the flip side of that, it's anytime that you miss time, it can raise some eyebrows, maybe raise some questions. Like we said, new offensive line coach in Ryan Clanton, new offensive coordinator Taylor Mauser. Also, it sounds like we're going to get some position certainty with Anthony Donko out at tackle, but I think it would have been nice to have him in there for spring and really get that entrenched because, like we said, he's played most of last year at right guard. Was back out at right tackle here and there. It seems like that maybe he'll have a more permanent home moving forward. And I think it would have been nice to really maybe lock that in with spring ball. But like we've said, we talked about Andrew Rapplier a couple of weeks ago, like Anthony Donko isn't the only one in this boat. There's other guys who are working back from things. And, I think maybe there is something to be said for sacrificing a little bit of spring ball so that by the time you get to the summer and fall camp, you're healthy and you're ready to go on that front.
Yeah, a reminder, we've seen this play out in the past. I remember a few springs ago, your eventual co-starters at tight end, Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, both had some things cleaned up. And that's really what this was. What relatively minor medical procedure to clean something up for Anthony Donko. And both of them were back for fall camp. Both of them had tremendous seasons, and now both of them have gone on to NFL success. But with Donko sidelined, Daniel, I'm reminded now there are no returning starters in spring ball. And that we do note that Dominic really did start in the Pinstripe Bowl, but that was his first start. And of course, if Nick Dawkins hadn't opted out of that game, he would have been the man at center. So there are competitions across the offensive front now, whether you're looking at guard, the center spot, whether you're looking at tackle, of course. And some of those names that we've discussed and we've written about at Lions247 recently have been those young offensive tackles. We heard from Anthony Donko about some of them. We had a chance to pick Anthony's brain in late February during that Thon event. We brought a lot of that conversation here to the podcast. I had a 1,000-word story about what's next for Donko over at the site. But along the way, we were discussing Garrett Sexton, a redshirt sophomore, Owen Alasine, a redshirt freshman, Malachi Goodman, a redshirt freshman. And then there's also some pieces that came from Iowa State that could play a role at tackle. A couple of redshirt freshmen, Will Tompkins, Kowal. But to me, Garrett Sexton stands out a bit because he is the veteran of that group. He hasn't played a bunch of Big Ten football to this point, but this is his third year with the program. He's a former top 24/7 recruit who spent half of his high school career focused at the quarterback position, made the move as his body grew to offensive tackle, was considered one of the top 15 to 20 offensive tackles in the 2023 recruit or 2023 recruiting 24 recruiting class, if I can recall correctly. And he came to campus as clearly a project when you're talking about a guy who has that little experience on the offensive line. He was about 260 pounds when he signed with this team at 6'6". Now he's about 310 pounds. And I said this before a few weeks ago when we brought him up in the conversation, considered one of the true high IQ members of this roster, regardless of position. And so he's gotten work at right tackle, left tackle, played both in some game action last year as a reserve player. But to me, he's someone who really has an opportunity to seize here because I've been kind of seeing him, although he's cross-trained, more in that right tackle conversation. Malachi Goodman's a guy that we've talked more in the left tackle conversation, though, again, expect reps on both sides of the ball for these guys. And Owen Alasine is someone that we also saw get feet wet with about 20 snaps in the season opener last year at left tackle, but we never saw him again. So starting with Sexton and working your way through whatever you want from that group of young Nittany Lions or young former Cyclones, what stands out to you about what awaits over these 15 spring practices on the offensive line's perimeter?
I think the thing that stands out to me is just the amount of reps in practice and, a little bit in the game that Garrett Sexton has on the right side. Like you laid it out, when we'd go into practice and we would, see things work out, in terms of those redshirt freshman offensive linemen last year, Sexton was almost always on the right side. Egan Boyer was almost always on the left side, from that class. And, I forget, if they would be with the second group or third group or whatever, but that's usually how it was divided up. We always saw Alasine on the left side. And then, Goodman, we never really got, a lot of looks at him in practice because he was mostly with the scout team. But he said that, he got a little bit of time on the right side, but it was primarily focused on the left side. I think he said moving forward, he's going to cross train, do both. But I think that just from where you're starting now, Sexton has that practice time banked on the right side and that experience. So, I think that that's something that, I don't know if advantage is necessarily the right term for it, but just where we are on paper, you feel a little bit more comfortable penciling that in. I think the Iowa State guys, they can be they can be the wild cards here because, we don't know too much about them. We didn't get to see them in practice. We're not necessarily sure how much they have banked and where that is. But yeah, I think the group that Penn State has coming back at tackle, it's a really intriguing group in terms of being young talents that we haven't seen much on the field. So I think that this spring, it's going to be a really great opportunity for all of those young guys, including the Iowa State transfers, to really get real reps out there.
Ideally, you'd still have Egan Boyer, and I think he'd probably be at the top of the totem pole in terms of tackles we're talking about right now. Instead, he follows Phil Troutwine to the Florida Gators, looking like a good chance for him to be Florida's starting tackle on the left side in 2026. But the guys who are here on campus, I think you project them out 6-7 years, talking NFL free agency, which we will later, who might command top dollar. It's hard to ignore Malachi Goodman because of that athletic pedigree. I think we brought this to the podcast, but offensive line coach Ryan Clinton told me during a recent conversation that Goodman probably has the best body fat to muscle mass ratio on the entire roster. And that's pretty impressive when you're talking about a 6'6", 315-pound offensive lineman. But I think right now, it's interesting because you're going to have a guy accruing a bunch of reps at right tackle, multiple guys. But I think it's known full well that Anthony Donko, as a healthy offensive lineman, is going to take that role. And so to me, it's how much can someone maybe parlay that big snap count at right tackle this year and not just maybe cementing themselves as the second team right tackle going into the season, but also maybe pushing that over to the left tackle conversation. Whether it's a guy like Owen Alasine or Garrett Sexton, who we talked about a lot of right tackle work, or Kwok Wall or Will Tompkins, can they challenge over at left tackle? Can they put in a lot of work here at the right tackle position and then feel like they can transition that to the opposite side? It's tough to do. I remember speaking with Nolan Rucci about this, Caden Wallace about it, guys we've seen play both tackle positions. You've really got to rewire your brain because you're essentially doing things in a mirror when you're on the different side. You have to kind of operate in the opposite direction. But a really good opportunity across the board for those young offensive tackles. And Daniel, to go back to a point you made earlier, and we brought up, there will be some guys missing from action. You talked about Andrew Rapplier. That was a bit of a surprise for us. That was just before we took our break here on the podcast. A tight end who finished last year on a hot streak, not going to be available for spring ball, but expected to make a recovery in time for fall camp. But when we talk about the entire field, another tight end, Gabe Burkle, will not be available for spring ball. He had an ACL injury last November with Iowa State, was a really key part of their offensive attack last year. Expect more of the same for the Nittany Lions when he can get healthy again and fully recovered. And then you look at the quarterback spot, of course, Rocco Becht. We've heard from the staff, we've heard from Rocco himself that he does anticipate to have some measure of work as spring practice schedule goes until late April. But initially, and maybe for a little while, he's not necessarily going to be available for everything. What else am I missing? I know there are some other pieces that we've kind of heard some things about that may or may not impact their opportunity to be at full go in the coming weeks ahead.
Yeah, when we were talking to Rocco Becht a couple of weeks ago, he mentioned that wide receivers Brett Eskelson and Chase Sowell are working back from things as well. And he said that when they get together for the player-led work on Saturdays, that they're with him in terms of not participating and helping guys and acting more as coaches instead of players. I do think that all these different pieces kind of moving around. I get why some people would be concerned, and I think it will be interesting in terms of how long it takes these guys to gel and for this team to gel. But I do think that prioritizing, being healthy, when the fall comes and, being ready for that, I think that can outweigh, maybe you can make that up, I think, in the fall as, missing a little bit of time in the spring. And also most of these guys that we've talked about, are pretty veteran. They've played a lot of ball. They would maybe be on that quote unquote pitch count, that we've talked about before. So, I think it's just, some moving parts right now, on the injury front and, trying to put things together for spring.
Before we turn the page from this topic, Tony Rojas, just remind us where things stand. I know on the last episode of this podcast, we talked about that in detail, but just kind of skim the surface on what his availability looks like here in the coming weeks and months.
Rojas said that he'll be full go by the summer. He did leave the door open towards maybe getting back into a little bit, near the end of spring. He said he's ahead of schedule. He said he feels good, but it sounds like that, he'll be ready for the summer and then, full go when they come back for fall camp.
Another team development that we were first to report at Lions247 during my vacation was that Trace McSorley has moved on to the NFL, former NFL quarterback after his career here with the Nittany Lions. He was set to be a second-year assistant quarterbacks coach, stuck around with the new staff, but instead joining forces with former Penn State GA Joe Brady, now the head coach of those Buffalo Bills, promoted to that job this winter. And Brady was a GA while Trace McSorley was making his move as a quarterback here with Penn State a decade ago. And what an opportunity for them to get together. You were the first to report this, Daniel. So what do you bring to the table here on the podcast regarding that move for Trace McSorley and what it might mean for the Nittany Lions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting move, for McSorley and for his career. He's only been a coach for 1 year. He spent, I believe, 2024 as a free agent in the NFL. He'd been with the Commanders in camp and, wasn't able to catch on. And so he came back in the spring to Penn State and joined the staff under James Franklin. I thought it was, pretty significant for Matt Campbell to retain Trace McSorley. Rocco Becht had good things to say about it. Matt Campbell did. Jake Waters did. I think that there was a lot of excitement about that because McSorley, not only played the game at a high level, but he did that here. And I think having some institutional knowledge after having a staff that had been in place for such a long time leave was pretty significant. And then everyone that you talk to, thinks that McSorley has the aptitude to be a good coach, good football coach. I talked to his high school coach. He said that. We heard that from James Franklin, Danny O'Brien. Heard good things from Drew Aller. Just across the board. I do think that it is kind of tough, for Penn State to lose him at this point. But he was the assistant quarterbacks coach. Basically an analyst. That's pretty far down. The food chain. It's not quite losing Noah Pauley to the Green Bay Packers in February. And so, it'll be interesting to see, how Penn State goes about filling that, if they go about filling that, that sort of thing. When you get to that point, I think on the coaching tree, it's not like mandatory, to have an assistant quarterbacks coach. You want to have a quarterbacks coach, but having someone with that assistant label, we'll see. But overall, I think it's a great opportunity for McSorley. I do think that walking into that situation with Buffalo, the fact that Brady, is a first-year coach, I think that gives you a little bit of runway, a little bit of stability. McSorley has a very young family right now. And he'll get to work with Josh Allen, who I don't think is going anywhere. And, that could definitely serve, as a launching pad, for him. But yeah.
I mean, if you're going to hitch your wagon to anybody in the NFL, Josh Allen's about as good as it gets. And it's kind of crazy here. You may not people may not even believe this, but Josh Allen is younger than Trace McSorley. And I know they've had different NFL careers, and one spent it in the spotlight and one spent it kind of bouncing roster to roster as a backup. But McSorley turned 30 last year, Josh Allen 29. So you spend some time with this guy working with this offense, and his label is offensive assistant. Got a real opportunity to do something special in the NFL on a young, hungry staff, and certainly one that wants to contend for a Super Bowl immediately. So good luck to Trace. We really enjoyed our interaction with him as a player here, a tremendous leader for the Nittany Lions. We didn't get to speak with him as much when he was a coach here, but good luck to him moving forward. And, of course, Jake Waters, the new quarterbacks coach. Trace McSorley did serve essentially as the interim quarterbacks coach last December after Danny O'Brien made his move down to Virginia Tech and joined James Franklin's Hokies staff. And so another staff change. We'll see if we're finally done with them. Just when we think we're done with them, it seems like something else pops up. Something else that we missed along the way with our vacation from the podcast, Daniel, was the scouting combine in Indianapolis, an annual showcase for former college standouts to put their skills on display, interview with a bunch of different GMs and coaches who are going to decide where guys land in the 7-round draft that comes in April out in Pittsburgh. So give us some guys who improved their stock from Penn State's draft class based on what you gathered. I know you did a great job keeping your finger on the pulse of the day-to-day developments out there in Indy.
Yeah, I think coming out of it, Denai Dennis Sutton was probably the biggest winner. I think part of it comes down to, he basically did the most. I think I saw that Khalil Dinkins, the tight end, was one of only 6 players to go through every single test, that was available to him out there. The way the combine is now, like a lot of guys aren't running, they aren't testing, out in Indy, they're waiting to pro days, or, some of them aren't doing it at all. Where, your mileage may vary on, whether you think that's, a good idea or the best approach, but, that's how things are going. I just pulled up Denai Dennis Sutton's spider chart on Mock Draftable. If you're not familiar with it, the spider chart is where, you've got, the center point and then, all the different things going out and they connect. And so, if your spider chart has a lot of color on it, that means that, you're, a pretty good athlete who's testing well. There's not a lot of color, then, you got some work to do. And I've got Denai's up and, a ton, of color, 93rd percentile in the 3-cone, 98th in the broad jump, 95th in the vertical, 85th in the 40-yard dash. One place that he got dinged was in weight, but he weighed in at like 256, which I think is a little bit lighter than, his playing weight. I think that might be a little bit more of a testing weight. I think Denai coming out of the combine, I think he helped himself. He's someone too that, he has the recruiting pedigree as a 5-star recruit. That's something that people keep in mind. That's a data point. As much as people want to say stars don't matter and they love to point at the 2-star that goes in the first round, I think the data backs us up that, if you're a 5-star recruit, you're more likely to be a first-round pick. He had production during his career at Penn State. Came and went a little bit. I think he closed last season strong. He closed this year strong as well. In the middle, a little bit left to be desired. But then, played in the Pinstripe Bowl. So I think that there are some intangibles that are going to stand out to people. So, I think coming out, of this, he did very well for himself. If you look at the mock draftable comparisons, the first one is Cameron Wembley, who I believe was a first-round pick in the 2000s. And then the second is Danielle Hunter, who's had a very, very long career with a lot of success in the NFL. So I think Denai did very well coming out of Indianapolis.
I mean, Denai was a guy that even last October, when he was not producing much at all, we kept saying he's still probably going to put on a solid show at the combine and help his case. But in between then and now, he went and piled up 6.5 sacks in the final 5 games. He had 2 of those sacks in the Pinstripe Bowl against Clemson with that high motor effort at playing 60-some snaps in a game where a lot of his teammates opted out. And many of them don't have close to the NFL draft outlook that Denai Dennis Sutton had entering that matchup. And ranked 6th all time in Penn State history with 23.5 sacks. We talked about his scheme versatility. I think you're right. I think he's 257 pounds because of the testing. Probably going to settle in 265, 270 range, I would imagine, as an NFL contributor. But I really, really like his chances to end up surpassing wherever he gets picked. I don't know where he's projected right now. I'd imagine somewhere solidly in day 2, round 2 to 3. If he falls beyond that, God bless whoever gets him, because they're getting an absolute steal. But I think even in that range, when you kind of project what he can do over the course of a 4-year rookie contract, I think the value is very much there. And of course, the edge rusher spot is such a premium position in the league, as we'll get to in a moment. I just noticed, I was sitting poolside. I was trying my best to avoid my laptop, trying my best to avoid our website this entire trip. But even I couldn't avoid the Zane Durant 40-yard dash buzz. And he's a guy that I remembered. He was rushing for touchdowns on high school fields in Florida. That was part of this mystique about Zane Durant, undersized defensive tackle, and yet so much explosion, so much intrigue as someone who can penetrate the interior. We didn't see as much of that production-wise during his senior campaign. He was a TFL monster a year before as a junior in a different defensive scheme. So he's someone that kind of turned my head. But I think the name that a lot of people were buzzing around, and not necessarily buzzing about, but trying to get their heads around him, is Drew Aller. And where do you think he is coming out of that NFL scouting combine? And now next week with Penn State Pro Day, there's going to be a lot of eyeballs on this guy. And we all remember before last season kicked off, you saw him projected as a top 10 draft pick, as vying to be QB1 on this draft board. And suddenly, Daniel, it seems like day 3 is the most likely possibility for Drew Aller. I know it's a pretty shallow QB draft class, so maybe that can bump him up a bit, but there's just not a lot of, I guess, upward momentum that I'm hearing, that I'm reading about Aller at this stage of the pre-draft process.
Yeah, I mean, Aller is always going to be an interesting case. I think even if he, finished the year healthy, he would still be a pretty polarizing prospect, because, you watch those drills and it's routes on air. yeah, like it's a controlled environment. Like, yeah, everything is scripted, but you watch him throw that deep ball, which we didn't get to see too often here, but and it's just so pretty, so easy, so smooth. Like it's the definition of arm talent. When you watch him get back there. And and so it's a little bit hard sometimes, I think, to square that sort of performance and what we know about him with what we saw on the field during his career. It seemed like it never quite connected. It never quite kicked into gear for him during his Penn State career. It's been kind of funny because it's like a lot of relitigating discussions that Penn State fans already had, over the past couple months, where suddenly, draft analysts and people who are really ramping up their coverage right now, it's kind of like, oh, like, who's this guy? Like, this guy's supposed to go day 3. What? What happened at Penn State? And it's like, well, a lot.
It's funny, Daniel, because I was going to say, watching the draft industry, which is ranges from people on national television on ESPN to people in mom's basement posting clips on social media. It's a very, very large range. It's a large group of people. But depending on if you type in Drew Allar on the search bar on X and scroll down, you'll see someone post his throw from Boise State and be like, this is a first-round arm talent. Why are we talking about him that way? And then you'll scroll down and see maybe a moment from Big Ten action this year, and people are saying, oh my gosh, what happened to Drew Allar? How did he go from a number 1 quarterback recruit to this at Penn State? And so, yeah, polarizing is probably the appropriate word. And to me, a lot of this is going to come down to what kind of environment he ends up in as an NFL rookie. Is it a situation where he's part of like a 2 or 3 man quarterback group where you've got like a couple journeymen there who haven't really won starting jobs, and he's a rookie and no one's all that excited about the offense? Maybe the coaching staff is already on the hot seat. Or does he go somewhere where they have an established, successful coaching staff? They have an established quarterback who is a starter, and there's no question about that. And Drew Allar has a chance to walk into that environment. And unlike Penn State, where all eyes were on him and everybody was like, when are you going to unseat Sean Clifford and take his job? It will be, let's see what this guy does with a little bit of slow cooking, year 1, year 2 at the NFL level. So I think so much of this is dependent on where he's picked. And I guess you could apply that to a lot of players, but it seems particularly important at the quarterback spot.
Yeah, we've been some of us on the beat we're talking, and we came up with the Rams as like I forget who exactly came up with it. It might have been Max Rowell from Penn Live, so I want to give credit where it's due. But the Rams kind of stand out as an environment where you go in, you don't have to unseat Matt Stafford right away. We know that that's very quarterback friendly. We know how Jared Goff looked in that offense. And so, yeah, like I think that's sort of the type of situation that, maybe you look at for Drew Allar. Like, I think that, you need some stability, around it, and you need to have good coaches, and you need to have some sort of infrastructure there, for him. But at the same time, I mean, he's a prospect that, like, I don't see him lasting out of day 2. Like, I think that his name is off the board by the end of the 3rd round. I think I put my range like between pick like 45 and 95. I wouldn't be surprised if he hears his name called. So, later in the, middle of the 2nd round to the, end of the 3rd round, because it only takes one coach, to fall in love with him. And there's a lot to fall in love with when it comes to Drew Allar. You would hope that, they did their homework on him and, were able to get in the room with him and, figure out if he is wired for what they want, and if he would fit in the right situation for them. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks, and, really interested to see what he does at Pro Day. Like, I think it's going to be a show, just because of that arm, and everything that goes along with it. So, we'll definitely see. It's going to be an interesting couple of weeks now.
Yeah, our Lions247 coverage team will be there on the sideline when Allar hits the field, and I'm assuming he's going to be throwing it to those 3 seniors from last season, and Kyron Hudson, Trevor Pena, and Devontae Ross. We'll get a better outlook for what Pro Day exactly is going to be entering next week. It's 9 days away, so big opportunity for him. And you're right, maybe he opens enough eyes where he goes off the board midway through round 2, and that's a different kind of circumstance that he's walking into. Or is it a situation where when you look at that best available board entering day 3 that when he's one of the top names on there. And you're like, how did Drew Aller get this far down? So a lot to figure out with Aller and the draft class. We'll bring the pro day conversation to you next week as we get eyes on these guys for ourselves. It'll be a really good exercise in reminding ourselves who these guys are as prospects after watching them play in pads for Penn State for a long time. You start to shift gears and project a bit more with them. And speaking of projecting, things are looking very good for a couple former Penn State players. One of them actually just got paid. Connor McGovern, a center for the Buffalo Bills, 4-year, $52 million contract. The Buffalo Bills keep him from testing free agency and keep him on board with Trace McSorley over there on the offensive end of things. But when you look at players from that 2018 Penn State recruiting class, which is held in very high regard, you're looking back now, Micah Parsons is the name that stands out, and he got $150 million from the Packers in his last contract. But guy that we used to call Jason Oweh, that now Odafe Oweh since he entered the league, and then Rasheed Walker, an offensive tackle, the Green Bay Packers. Both of them are considered top free agents. And I just thought we'd address this real quick because free agency is opening in the NFL. By the time you hear this, there may be reports about where they are heading at this stage. But let's start with Oweh, a guy who was a top 100 overall recruit coming out of Blair Academy in New Jersey, someone that I got to know really early in the process, spent some time with him and his coach, different camps. I think that I got a chance to kind of get to know Oweh before it really blew up, and to see him get to this point is kind of the fulfilling of what was viewed as this sky high potential that maybe had no limit. He was a guy who picked up high school football as a junior. He was a basketball guy initially. That was kind of supposed to be his track. It ended up being his younger brother's track. But Odafe Oweh comes to Penn State, turns heads early with some of the physical measurements and testing, 7 sacks through a couple seasons. And although he did earn all Big Ten status as a redshirt freshman during that short 2020 season, no sacks. And we wondered, okay, how does that translate to the pre-draft process? Well, ultimately, the counterbalance of his potential and his incredible athleticism, where I believe he ran a sub-4.4 40-yard dash at his pro day at 6'5", 250 plus pounds. A freak. I mean, that's he's truly that guy. We call a lot of guys freaks. He is truly one of them. Went to the Baltimore Ravens with pick number 31 overall in 2021. In his first 4 seasons with the Ravens, the 23 total sacks, he had 10 of those in 2024. They exercised that 5th-year option. He made $13 million last year with that 5th-year option, but 0 sacks through 5 games with the Ravens. Midseason trade to the Chargers, and he heats up. 7.5 sacks the rest of the season. 1 playoff game, 3 sacks on 25 total snaps, 2 forced fumbles against the New England Patriots. So you want to talk about entering free agency with a real stride. Odafe Oweh has done that. And when you look at some projections along the way, Daniel, including from The Athletic, and I know CBS, they're viewing him as a top 10 range free agent overall and projecting a 4-year, $90+ million contract for Oweh. And so let's start with him. We'll talk about Rasheed Walker in a moment, but this, again, is a guy who's going to be 27 years old when next season begins. And I got to remind myself, late to the game in football, he really may just be entering his prime in a football uniform. And whoever signs him could get a high-impact edge rusher for the next several years.
Definitely. The edge rusher spot, like, it's such a premium position in the NFL. And, you want guys that can get 3 sacks in a playoff game, can really alter the complexion of a game for your defense. And I think Oweh has proven that maybe he can be, one of those guys, that he is someone that, maybe is putting it all together and can do that on a consistent basis. I think during his time with the Ravens, that was a little bit of a knock against him that, wasn't really happening consistently. 13 sacks in his first 3 seasons. He missed a couple games here and there, but, was largely played the full seasons. Then 10 sacks in 2024, and then 7.5 in the final 12 games of last season. I think that he's someone who, maybe it took a little bit for his feet to get under him. I think going to the Chargers, it was a good change of scenery for him, and a good opportunity in that way. And I think that he has the potential to really catapult himself moving forward into a, big time edge rusher if he can keep this up.
Yeah, and it's been a fun journey to follow. We didn't see it necessarily come to full capacity here at Penn State, but you knew that there was a chance it could click in the NFL, and it certainly seemed to during the last few months of the 2025 season. And then shifting over to a 2018 classmate, another guy that I got to go visit at his high school down in Maryland back in the days, Rasheed Walker. And he was a top 50 prospect at the time. Speaking with him and his high school coach a few months before he enrolled here at Penn State, it was very clear that he had the ability to reach this point in his career. Then he comes to Penn State. By year 2, he's a starting left tackle for the Nittany Lions. And I thought his redshirt sophomore season in 2020, during that bummer of a year overall, thought he looked like you saw the signs of a potential top 50 type NFL draft pick. 2021, I believe that was your first year on the beat, Daniel?
Yes.
One of the worst collective offensive line performances that we've seen around here. Probably the worst we've seen for Penn State, but it was brutal. Last, I think, in the Big Ten in rushing, had a lot of trouble protecting Sean Clifford, and that stink of that season was certainly on Rasheed Walker as well. I think he got third team all conference honors in 2021, but didn't really play in the dominant way that we expected as a redshirt junior. And on top of that, he finished the year sidelined. He missed the last couple Big Ten games. He was on crutches at the Outback Bowl. He could not participate in the Combine or Pro Day. And so a lot of questions about him entering the NFL draft, and that was reflected with a round 7 selection to the Green Bay Packers. A couple years later, he breaks through as a starter for Green Bay, and he is stuck with that. 48 of the last 51 games starting offensive tackle for the Green Bay Packers. First few years of that rookie deal, making less than $1 million in base salary. It was up to $3.4 million last year, and he is set for a massive pay raise. The projection from The Athletic, 4 years, $88 million. They have him as the top offensive tackle. You're a Packers fan, so I know you followed particularly close attention to Rasheed Walker, and I know that you don't necessarily see them doing what it takes to keep him on that roster. And I'd imagine his agent's going to be busy. There's a lot of tackle-needy teams that want to keep their quarterback upright this upcoming season. So take us through the journey that you've witnessed of Rasheed Walker, because you don't miss many Packers games. I miss most of them, but I watched every single one of his snaps here at Penn State.
Yeah, Rasheed Walker, it's an interesting case. And I do think that the way that his Penn State career ended, I think left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. But I think that you really have to give him credit for getting to this point in the NFL. 7th round picks, you're not supposed to do much. When you get picked there, like the rate of success is pretty low. And the Packers, they, once he started at left tackle for them, like they had him in a rotation for a little bit. I think Josh Nijman and him were splitting time. Rasheed Walker outlasted that. A couple of years ago, they drafted Jordan Morgan in the first round out of Arizona. And I think some of the thought was he could potentially, unseat Walker on the left side. That didn't happen. He's someone that has, really, really sustained and carved out a career for himself. I think from the, watching every game granularly with emotional investment, perspective, there were, some untimely penalties here and there, over the course of his career. But I think that, it's someone that really does have that talent. He still has that talent that made him a, top 50 recruit, like you said, coming out, and someone who could be a full-time starter in the Big Ten, by his second season. I saw some rankings that has him as the number 1 offensive tackle available. I think the way that these things go, a lot of times high-level, offensive tackles, they don't necessarily make it to free agency. It's something that, teams want to lock up when they have them, or you pay a bounty, in draft picks to bring them over, to your team. So it is, I think, a little unusual for someone, in this caliber, to be available. And I think that has a little bit more to say about the Packers than Walker necessarily. So it'll be interesting to see, what his market is. Now, and speaking of markets, to go back to Oweh, something that might add a little bit of context. The report is that, Jalen Phillips, who finished last year with the Eagles, he's signing with the Panthers for 4 years, $120 million, $80 million guaranteed. And that's someone who, same draft class, someone who has some injury issues, season high or career high in sacks is 8.5. Might not necessarily have the same production track record as Odafe Oweh. I don't know ball enough to really compare and contrast them as players. But, from the age profile, production profile, I think that gives us a little bit of an example of the pool that Odafe Owe is going to be swimming in.
Yeah, Phillips was largely considered the number 1 overall recruit in his high school class. And by the way, that number will be well received from anyone representing Odafe Owe right now. You love to see that kind of market setting deal go out, and now we'll see how they build off that. Maybe he can eclipse 100 million when it's all said and done. We'll have that tracked over at Lions247.com in the days to come as free agency heats up. And a lot of the guys that we got familiar with when they were 16, 17-year-old making mega bucks, good for them, excited for them. Daniel, we'll get you on probably later in the week. We have some more stuff to talk about as spring practice rolls closer. But thanks so much for playing catch up with me on this episode. And thanks very much for letting me get aside with the family and doing a little bit of more heavy lifting in my absence over at Lions247.com for the last week.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. And one more note for our listeners, basketball, Penn State basketball is in the Big Ten tournament on Tuesday night. We're not expecting necessarily a long stay in Chicago. So, off season will start later this week, which means transfer portal. Mike Rhodes got asked about his coaching future last week. There's going to be I think it'll be a pretty busy off season on that front. So stay tuned to Lions247 for that.
We've done a damn good job of staying away from basketball on this podcast, but we will be due for an autopsy of sorts about what happened this season and what comes next with you and Mark Brennan on this podcast. I promise we'll get to that. I just don't think a lot of people were all that interested in us investing time this season. All right, I'll talk to you soon, buddy.
Thanks, Tyler.
As promised, we now turn our focus to the recruiting trail with Tyler Calvaruso. He was on our last episode about 9-10 days ago, fresh off a visit here to the campus, talking to a bunch of Penn State players. We're going to talk to him in his normal capacity about the future of the Nittany Lions football program. Good to get you back on, Tyler. I was kind of sort of loosely following your work during vacation, as I said earlier on the show. Tried my best to stay away from Lions247.com when I was off the clock. But you did great work, a ton of updates going to our folks, our VIP subscribers on the site. So glad we can bring some of that to the conversation here on the pod.
No, first things first, welcome back. Good to have you back in town. Good to be back on. It was a nice week off, but I kind of missed it, man. I missed our weekly chats because there's a lot to get into. We're inching closer to spring ball by the day. Spring break right now, but there's still a lot going on. You got visits getting locked in, position boards are coming together, so plenty for us to sort through here today.
A big theme of spring ball is going to be spectators on the sideline and high school standouts who are making their first trips or maybe their second or third trips to campus, getting to see this staff work with players in person over the course of those practice sessions. But official visits always loom large because that's a chance to really try to separate yourself with an intimate experience across the campus and really try to show off the pillars of your program behind the scenes, multiple days, mom and dad, brother and sister, sometimes grandparents, aunts and uncles are there with you. There's a lot to be gained from these official visits. So tell us so far what the strategy has been for this new coaching staff and how many of these are we seeing get lined up right now for the spring?
You're over 24 now, so it's a jam-packed slate. There's still room to add, and there are going to be additions throughout spring practice. There are a bunch of top targets on the board for Penn State on both sides of the ball who have yet to lock in an official visit, like Sean Curie, who was just on campus over the weekend. He's a top tight end target for Penn State out of New Jersey. He's committed to Virginia right now, but giving the Nittany Lions a long look, he's going to lock in an official. That's just the example of the kind of guy that Penn State is going to get on campus for officials once that begins in June. You've got focus on the 3 June weekends, June 5th through the 7th, June 12th through the 14th, June 19th through the 21st. Right now, you're not seeing any April visits come together like some programs are doing. Not seeing any May visits. That's where the confusion kind of came with Stanley Montgomery's official visit. He was originally logged in for that May 29th, June 31st, or May 31st weekend, but they're not doing official visits that weekend. That's not the plan. Focused on those 3 weekends that I mentioned. So the numbers are coming together. Kyler Kuhn, the top 24/7 offensive lineman out of the Midwest. He is the latest recruit to lock in an official visit. He's going to be on campus June 19th through the 21st. So you're seeing a lot of top targets closing on dates. I think the timing of some of these visits is going to be very, very interesting because there are some programs that are going the early official visit route. Like Indiana, for example, is getting Khalil Taylor, elite wide receiver who's at the top of that Penn State board. He's going to be taking an official to Indiana in April, right? So Is that early OV going to work against Indiana, or is it going to work in favor of Indiana to the point where it impresses where, maybe he doesn't make some other trips? I think that's something that you have to monitor throughout official visit season with every guy. Where are Penn State's top targets heading before they get back to State College? I think that's important in a lot of cases. Like I use Taylor as an example. I mean, it's not just Indiana that's going to get him before Penn State, Georgia as well. And that's going to be a really big visit. Carter Jones, a top target on the offensive line, another guy who's going to be visiting a program like Georgia. And we could do this with a bunch of the guys on Penn State's official visit schedule. A lot of these guys, they hit OV season intent on making all these visits, but they get somewhere before they get to Penn State and they decide they want to call that home. So I think that's a really interesting element of this that we need to monitor when it comes to official visit planning. But as things currently stand, you have each of the 3 official visit weekends for Penn State, I would say pretty evenly spaced out in terms of top targets. There were cycles with James Franklin and his staff where you see things a bit front loaded, where the first 2 weekends or the first 2 or 3 weekends are the big ones. And then you save that last official visit weekend for some guys who maybe aren't necessarily on the back burner, but they become a take for you if certain dominoes fall against you. Seems like this OV slate right now, a little bit more evenly spaced because you have some very clear priority targets. A guy like Kyler Kuhn, a guy like Isaiah Rodgers, a 4-star running back out of Massachusetts, and Blake Benton, a linebacker out of Minnesota, who are very clearly top targets at their position, but they're still set to visit during that final official visit weekend. So it's a spread out, balanced slate as things currently stand.
And basically sustaining, at least from a timeline perspective, of what they did with James Franklin's staff and focusing on those June weekends for the official visits after the true spring months. And early on when the spring official visit window opened, if you recall, folks, that it wasn't that long ago that was only seeing official visits during the season or in December. We saw Penn State get a bunch of official visitors on campus for their spring game. And I recall that being really impactful for the 2019 recruiting class, with a bunch of top targets on campus for that weekend, staying in a hotel and then coming to the spring game. And now you're seeing it waiting for June. We'll see how that all plays out. And June is going to be a busy month for us as usual on the coverage scene for recruiting. We're going to have prospect camps to cover, these official visit weekends to preview and then analyze afterwards. And no one does that better than Tyler Calvaruso over at Lions247.com. When it comes to the spring visits that I alluded to before we got into the OV discussion, guys just spending an afternoon on campus, maybe sticking around after practice to grab some dinner or something like that, get a bit of a feel for what this campus is like. But more so, the mission to me would seem, how does this coaching staff interact with their players? And how do they do that drill by drill and then through 11-on-11 work and getting a chance to see the scope of how this new Nittany Lions staff wants to operate on the field? What kind of an opportunity do you sense approaching as the team gets ready to put those cleats and pads back on and for Matt Campbell to lead his first Penn State practices?
Because you said it comes down to how they interact with their players, how they can go about developing their players on the practice field. This staff, it's been very clear from the start. Just look at the way they operate at Iowa State. Spring practices are big. This spring window is big for Penn State. They want to get guys who are top targets and some guys who are a little bit under the radar right now as well. They want to get them to campus, and they want these recruits to get eyes on their position coach. They want these recruits to get eyes on Matt Campbell and the coordinators, because they want them to see what it could be like for them if they were going to play at Penn State. And I think there's a pretty, I could say, potentially positive outcome that comes along with that, in the sense of guys liking what they see and then proceeding to lock in official visits, or Penn State moving up the list in a pretty significant manner. Because I think if you reflect on what the staff accomplished in January during junior day visits with the guys who did visit, they made pretty strong and positive impressions. So we've seen that this staff can get the ball rolling in the right direction. Now you're doing it in a little bit different of an element. You factor in the on-field stuff. It's more of an X's and O's conversation. It's more of a look at the X's and O's and the individual developmental ability of this staff during practice drills. So there are several facets of a practice session that this staff feels is paramount for recruits to see. They want these guys to get the full scope of what is going on the practice field at Penn State. And they want these recruits to know, hey, look, you come play running back for Savon Huggins, you come play wide receiver for Kashif Moore. This is what it's going to be for you. It's what it's going to be like for you on the field. It's like what it's going to be for you, sitting in position room meetings as well. There's so much that's going to go into these spring visits that I think can pay dividends for Penn State on the trail long term, because going in the spring evaluation period as well, you're going to see some guys who we're not talking about right now either climb up the board, get offers, and then lock visits in, or just guys who are on the board right now skyrocket. So this staff wants to make the most of this spring practice visit window. And if you look at the number of visitors that recruits have already locked in visits, or at least tentatively locked in visits, because we all know how fluid these schedules can be, it's a healthy number of top targets. I think that's exactly the way the staff wanted it. It's coming together nicely. There are still guys that Penn State very much needs to get back on campus who have yet to lock in visits, but when it comes to many of those guys, you ask around, it sounds like it's just a matter of finding the right date. So bottom line, it's going to be a very busy and very important spring window for this Penn State staff.
You mentioned him in passing a few moments ago, but can you tell us a little bit about the early feedback on Kashif Moore as wide receivers coach? You did a great job of breaking down what you thought Noah Pauley brought to the table when he was initially brought over from the Iowa State staff. And a little bit later on, you talked about what you were hearing from the recruiting trail on Pauley, and it was a lot of positives. But now he's coaching with the Green Bay Packers. Moore comes in after a couple months with Colorado State. We've talked about his pedigree a little bit. Relatively short resume at this level, but at UConn, coached a Biletnikoff Award finalist and All-American in Skylar Bell last year with the Huskies, and had a lot of success as a player himself wearing a UConn uniform as a receiver. Tell us what you're hearing, and then also about a new target to the south in Alabama that Penn State has put an offer out to.
We'll learn a lot more throughout these spring practice visits because none of these guys have been on campus with Moore yet. The early intel has been positive. It sounds like he's done a pretty good job building relationships with the top guys on his board. Seems like a pretty charismatic guy that recruits are taking a liking to, but we'll learn a lot more about Kashif Moore. We're going to learn a lot more about Kashif Moore's board in the coming weeks at wide receiver. It's a board that is still coming together through evaluations and just kind of getting a feel for where certain guys stand on things. So I'm looking forward to that. We're kind of starting to get some initial inklings of where things are heading at wide receiver in terms of guys who are top priorities, and Deshaun Hall is going to be very much part of that conversation moving forward. Top 24/7 wideout out of Alabama. Elite athlete, high-level basketball player, has some high major basketball offers. That's probably not going to be the route that he takes in college. He's looking to play football. That's his focus, and Penn State is a program catching his eye right now. Nittany Lions offered on the back half of February, around February 20th, and this wasn't a name that I heard until last week, but now that I've heard it, I mean, it's pretty clear that he's a guy who has climbed up this board in short order. The skill set and upside, big reason why. And I got the chance to catch up with Hall a little bit late last week. He loves the way this process is playing out with Penn State so far. He likes Kashif Moore. He likes Matt Campbell. He likes Penn State's plan for its football players beyond the game, what comes after football when you hang up the cleats. He feels like Penn State is a place he can go and be taken care of in all areas. I think it's going to be tough to get Hall out of the South when it's all said and done. Auburn's in pretty strong. He has an official visit locked in there. He's got Tennessee. There's an official visit locked in with the Vols. He's going to be at Penn State for an official in early June, in addition to an April spring practice visit. And I mentioned that specifically in that order because I think there is an element of this recruitment where the South programs are going to be prominent, but a program like Penn State could be a player because I don't think distance is going to be much of a factor. I think when he sits down at the end of it all, those SEC programs are going to have a pretty strong pull, but he's not going to factor it in as, oh, well, this is a little bit closer to home versus a program like Penn State or a Michigan that just offered and is making a push. He's not going to turn those schools down because of proximity to his home in Alabama. And I think that's going to keep Penn State in this mix for the long run. And good news for Penn State getting that official visit locked in early and getting a spring ball visit locked in as well, because Hall is going to be taking nearly a dozen spring practice visits, and Penn State wants to get on that schedule. They're going to get his first crack at him early April.
Yeah, get this kid on campus and maybe get him in front of Mike Rhodes too. He's got some basketball offers.
I think they need as much help as they could get. So
yeah, he's got some significant basketball offers too. And I'm looking at his stat line, which we have on our 24/7 Sports profile. He was a Player of the Year in Alabama on the basketball court. Listen to this: he averaged 20 points, 12 rebounds, almost 4 blocks, almost 4 steals per game across a 30 matchup schedule. So he is a true baller on the hardwood. And then an emerging figure at the receiver position, 6'5", 185 pounds. You don't find those measurements with a lot of receivers. And often when you do, they're not quite coordinated enough to play at this level. In this case, you're talking about someone who's a top 25 wide receiver nationally, a top 200 overall recruit nationally. And I think Deshaun Hall is the kind of guy who goes out, shows up at a couple camps on the upcoming circuit, and all of a sudden people start raving about him, and the rankings reflect that. And so, by the way, the Crimson Tide, also put an offer on the table for him too. So plenty to consider to the south. We'll see if State College can turn his attention. Tyler, let's finish this conversation. And there's so much more from the last week and a half of recruiting coverage from Tyler Calvaruso over at Lions247.com. For our VIP subscribers, 50% off right now for an annual VIP deal at Lions247. But tell us a little bit about how the quarterback and running back boards are coming together. You got Jake Waters, the new QB coach. A little bit later arrival to the staff was Savon Huggins, the running backs coach. What's happening in both of those boards?
Starting at quarterback, because, that's the center of every recruiting conversation. This 27 cycle, Penn State wants to land a high-level quarterback, and they're working on doing so. You've got I'd say a pretty clear duo of top targets right now in Peter Bork and Will Menzel. Bork's a guy we talked about a ton throughout the 2027 cycle. Tabor Academy, Massachusetts, one of the top quarterbacks in this 27 class. Now that he's back on the market, backed off that Michigan commitment that he levied during the summer, Penn State very, very much in the mix, as it was while he was still committed to the Wolverines. They've been pushing this one for a while. That goes for the previous staff, and the new staff jumped right on Peter Bork as soon as it arrived in State College, immediately identified him as one of the top guys that they want in this class. He should be back on campus during spring practice. Our guy Brian Doan dropped a note on when that visit could occur. I don't want to spoil it here on the pod, but bottom line, we're expecting Peter Bork on campus for a spring practice visit on the latter side of spring ball, but that's going to be a really, really big visit. One thing with Peter Bork that I do want to note, because me and you, this is the case in every quarterback recruitment. We've always talked about how quarterback recruiting operates on an accelerated timeline. Those guys move a lot earlier than most. I don't think Peter Bork is going to move with the same speed as some of the other top quarterbacks in this 27 cycle. This is a kid who was locked in at Michigan, liked the way things were going there with that staff before Sharon Moore was fired in December. It's a new staff there. He likes that group, still considering Michigan, but wants to get out, make visits. I don't get the sense that he is in any sort of rush by any definition of the word to get this thing done. I think he could very easily go through his June OVs before wrapping this one. Will Menzel is on the other end of the spectrum. He could announce as early as later this month, from what I've heard, maybe April. So that one's trending in a completely different direction timeline-wise. I think that's going to have a direct impact on his spring practice visit schedule. That's coming together. Another one where he is expected at Penn State for a visit before he makes a final call. Oregon's going to be pretty tough to beat in this one. That's the feeling I get. Auburn is another one that is going to be tough for Will Menzel. Miami's making a late push. They're coming hot and heavy after the top 100 quarterback. He made a big jump in our recent rankings update. He did almost a complete overhaul of the top 24/7, and he's up in that top 100. I think he has the tools to climb even further as his development continues. But look, there is a tie here for Penn State. There are a couple ties that I think make the Nittany Lions a factor. Taylor Mauser, he's from Arizona. Chandler, to be specific, which is where Will Menzel plays his high school ball. Penn State's going to be active in Arizona with this staff in place as long as Mauser's around. So that's big. Also, Ty Wisdom, the head coach at Chandler, he was the head coach in Nebraska for a long time at Millard South. This Penn State group knows him very, very well. That's a good relationship to have here. I think that has helped Menzel to get a good feeling for what this Penn State staff is truly about before ever visiting. And that's why the Nittany Lions are garnering real consideration. I know I say it's going to be a tough one, but the Nittany Lions are getting a real look here. And they're going to get that chance to make a very strong impression when he visits. So those are the two clear top quarterback targets. You look at some secondary guys. Will Wood is one this staff really, really likes. Another Massachusetts quarterback. He's set for an early or late March spring practice visits and early spring practice visits, kind of the first half of spring ball. An offer is definitely possible. And if one goes out, Penn State's going to be pretty tough to beat. Wood, good high character, smart quarterback from everyone you talk to. He's coming into his own physically. He's continuing to develop. The film is solid. So I think Will Wood is one to keep an eye on at quarterback moving forward beyond those top two. There are some other evaluations taking place at the position as well. That's why I mentioned the spring eval period being big here, because there are some guys at quarterback that we might not be discussing right now who could emerge in a big way. We saw with Ethan Grunkemeyer a couple of years ago, and it could happen with this Penn State staff. So those are the guys. Yeah.
Before you talk running backs, I know you're about to pivot that way.
Yeah.
Just to kind of tell people how close Bork and Menzel are in our rankings. Bork is the number 80 overall recruit, number 7 quarterback out of Massachusetts, and then Menzel, as you mentioned, out of Arizona, 89 overall, number 8 quarterback. So when you're looking at the pecking order of quarterbacks, these two are slotted right there firmly in the top 10. And there's a case to be made, flip a coin on who is who the better prospect is at this point. Yeah. And so those are the 2 targets that you really spotlighted right here. Quickly, what do we got at running back to consider with Savon Huggins leading that room now?
So, I mean, the obvious thing, come on, Spell, they're going to continue chipping away at that one until he signs somewhere in December. He's committed to Georgia right now. I think the Dogs have a pretty good shot at hanging on to him, but Penn State's not going to go away there until that one is done. So I have to mention, come on, Spell, I feel like I'm obligated to do so. We would not be a running back board conversation without him. But beyond that, a lot of the usual suspects that we've brought up since this new staff arrived at State College. Isaiah Rogers from Massachusetts. I touched on him a little bit earlier. He remains high in that pecking order. Got a couple guys from South Carolina. A lot of Southeast Carolina's action in this class so far. For Savon Huggins, you've got Aiden Gibson out of South Carolina as a top 24/7 running back, newly minted top 24/7 running back. He's got an official visit scheduled. Trey Segura out of South Carolina. He's the number 5 running back in the 2027 class. That's a guy the Nittany Lions really, really like. I'm not sure they get him in the end, but that's a guy they're going to get on campus for spring ball early in April. That's going to be a big visit because they want to get an official visit locked in there. Dejon Rhodes from Washington, D.C., plays at St. John's College. Huggins recruited him to Boston College. He's a top target on that board there. He's a top target for this Penn State staff now. Then, of course, Kelvin Morrison, the in-state standout. He visited in January. He's got a spot in this Penn State class right now if he wants it, from my understanding. So he's going to take some officials. He's going to take some spring practice visits, but Penn State's in really, really strong there. There are some other guys a little bit. Oh, Gary Walker as well. Gary Walker is a guy we need to talk about a lot more moving forward. He moved up the board big time in February. Penn State staff loves the evaluation there. They love Gary Walker's character. They think he'd be a great fit in this running back room on and off the field. Big time jump in the rankings over last week. Number 161 overall. I believe he's a number 7 running back in the 2027 class now. He's a big time player against good competition. Anytime you watch film and you see a running back in Georgia doing it, especially in a high classification, that kid can play. Gary Walker falls into that realm. So that's kind of the crux of it right now. There are some secondary names that we're monitoring right now at the running back position as the evaluation process continues, but that's the main core group at the position that are high on that board for Huggins.
Good stuff, Tyler. We appreciate the breakdown. We know there's a lot more to get into on recruiting, and you do that on a daily basis over at Lions247.com. You'll be back on the pod before long, I have no doubt. We got a lot more to cover. Good stuff. And while I was away, you were cranking it out as usual. So much appreciated, my friend.
No, I appreciate it, man. I hope you enjoyed your time off. And like I said, it's great to be back with you.
Thanks. I did indeed enjoy that time back. But like I said, excited to be back because we have football back on the field this month. And we got a lot to learn about these Nittany Lions. This is so unlike the other spring balls that I've encountered here. This will be my 10th season covering Penn State, believe it or not. And this time around, we've got 50 new players on the roster, essentially an entire new coaching staff for the most part, and just so much to learn about these guys. We look forward to bringing you all that information and intel as those practices begin to stack up later this month. For now, the university on spring break. We will be back later this week, and we'll have an opportunity to dive into more on Penn State football. Join us then. For now, stepping aside on behalf of Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso, I am Tyler Donahue, and this has been the Lions 24/7 Podcast.